Good morning. Thank you for coming and welcome to our panel. Industrial clusters around the world are essential in driving economic growth and employment, but their impact right now is limited by the lack of cooperation and common vision from co-located companies and governments. Today, we will explore this topic and talk about what kind of standardized approach, or potentially not standardized approach, can help industrial clusters to reach their full economic, employment, and environmental potential. We have a group of participants here who bring perspectives from a very diverse parts of the ecosystem that are ultimately going to be needed to create frameworks for these clusters. A very international group as well. We have, at the end, we have Martin Brudermüller, Chairman of the Board of Executive Directors of BASF. Jacques sorry, I've got the order wrong here, but next to him we have Lei Zhang, who is Chief Executive Officer of Envision Group. We have Martin Brudermüller, Chairman of the Board of Executive, sorry, I've done that already. Jacques van der Meuren, CEO, Port of Antwerp, Bruges. And next to me we have Nobumitsu Hayashi, Governor of the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. I should remind you that if the online audience is sharing anything about this panel through your social channels, you should use hashtag WEF24, as you also should do if you are in the audience. I'd like to ask each of you to start by talking a little bit about your own experiences trying to build these kinds of clusters, work that you're doing currently, work that you have done, and to share some specifics with us. I'd like to start with Jacques, since the Port of Antwerp-Bruges is such an important link in the global logistics chain. You've been committed to the greening of the port. You've taken a lot of steps, and not just the port. How have you built an industrial cluster that is contributing to growth and to the energy transition? And why did you think it was necessary to take these steps?
Well, maybe a few words on the Port of Antwerp. It's the second largest in Europe and number 13 in the world. And we host, and that's one of the strengths of the Port of Antwerp, we host the biggest integrated petrochemical cluster of Europe and the second largest of the world. And that's not new. That started in the 50s and in the 60s. So our experience with industry within the port area on a short distance, it's of course something that we experience for more than 5 decades. And so the role of a port is not only being the landlord, being the regulator, being an operator, but also a community builder, having the luxury of more than 1,400 companies in industry, in logistics, in maritime business, in and within our port area is, of course, something that you have to capture. It's an opportunity, and especially when it comes to transition, digital transition, energy transition, but also the focus now on circular economy. It's an opportunity to make an impact, to have an impact on not only in Belgium, in Flanders, but for a huge part of Europe. Antwerp, together with Rotterdam, are the two main gates for Europe when it comes to energy. Already now, today, and since decades, of course, fossil fuels, crude oil and natural gas, LNG, and tomorrow probably the green, and hopefully the green electron and the green molecules, being methanol or ammonia. So we are an important shackle in the whole value chain when it comes to industry. And we have, of course, that industry within our port area, but all the main industrial clusters in Europe are located within a range of 300 or 400 kilometers from Antwerp. So that's, I think, the main reason why a port has to be focused on the future of industry and industrial clusters. And we see, of course, a lot of opportunities when it comes, for instance, to CCS, an important technology to capture carbon on the short term that we are currently developing with lots of industrial players, but also how to bring green electrons, how to store them. Same for molecules in the port, so that our industry, because that's the main target, our industry in Europe can maintain their competitiveness and maintain their employment, their added value for the economy.
I want to come back to a couple of things, but I'd like everybody to get a chance to introduce themselves. Martin, you have a connection to the port at Antwerp with your Verbund site there. Can you explain how you've built this cluster? What is a Verbund? And how do you want to develop it and move forward in the kind of framework that Jacques is describing?
I mean, BASF is still the largest chemical company in the world, and if you want, so the cluster is part of our DNA. We run the broadest portfolio because that fits to the philosophy how we produce. We actually run value chains on one side, and we even interlink the value chains, and that comes basically to large company-owned clusters. This is the most efficient way to produce. It's also the most environmentally friendly way to produce because you can use off-heat from one plant in the other. You can use waste streams. You have in everything economies of scale, so it's always basically the lowest cost and also the highest efficiency. That's usually then the crystallization point because then partners come. Then customers link to your cluster, suppliers link to your clusters, and also infrastructure is basically linking into the cluster. We run 6 of these sites, and we have just a 10 billion euro investment into a grassroots green field cluster in Guangdong in China. So we are part then of the overall cluster Antwerp, which is then even increasing the efficiency because you have then pipeline systems, you have service companies, all having also economies of scale because there are a lot of customers. And in that respect, we are a big customer of Jacques because we bring in our stuff via the port and also export. And what is, I think, an important message is also when we talk about the transformation. The transformation is easiest in these clusters because you have also economies of scale of your transformation. And you can do it stepwise. You don't have to do everything at one point, but you have several steps where you actually reduce the CO2. That's also where we, for example, join forces with some other companies and the port by building up CCS in Europe. And for that, doing that the first time in large scale. And it only works on cooperation in the companies, but also beyond, because we need to have export facilities from the port then to the sinks. But we have also to do our homework on the sites to actually combine this. And in that respect, I would say running the heavy industry in terms of chemistry, steel, and all of that, I think the only way to do that is in a cluster. And for that reason, I think this is an important topic we talk about today. The question is how to get the cluster into a green future.
That's a very good question for us to come back to as well. Lei, can you tell us about the Ordos project, which is a greenfield project, a greenfield cluster, and very ambitious in China's biggest coal city? Tell us how this is an example of a new industrial cluster, and how do you think through the development of such a cluster?
Right, so we strongly believe this net zero transition is going to have a deep impact on the industrial cluster revolutions. So the Ordos Net Zero Industrial Park actually is an industrial cluster focused on the use of green energy and also with green industrial development. So, the transition for the energy is also bring the transition for industries. If you look back at the history, so the industrial revolution starts in Manchester. So it's because of energy. It's close to the coal, and because of the steam engine, make use of the coal, make Manchester become an industrial cluster. Before that, actually industrial cluster is close to the river, using the river power. So that's kind of transition. Now we are moving from the coal industry, new oil, new gas, new coal, which is wind, solar, green hydrogen, is going to be the new form for energy. So how can we organize the use of green energy? Because green energy is going to be more cost competitive than fossil fuel today. And if you are able to build in place like Ordos, which is abundant renewable energy, much cheaper, and with technology like new energy control system to make it fully off-grid, but with stable applications, then you are building an emission-free industries, which is aiming for actually reduce exposure to carbon tariff or carbon exposure, and also with lowest cost of green energy. This is something we see is particularly exciting. And when we do this project in Erdos, so we building the wind farm with storage, with digital control system, make it very dynamic and orchestrated to producing batteries, which is we're producing 10 gigawatt battery facility with furthermore add-on. We also introduce largest solar manufacturer into the region, also set up the downstream business, which is a commercial vehicle assembling company and production company, also upstream for the lithium phosphate company. We see the cluster is going to be, it's developing much faster, and it become a natural magnet to everyone for the green industry, especially with energy-intensive use case.
That's fascinating. You have to pay for that somehow, so we should talk about finance. Hayashi-san, explain to us why it makes sense to finance. I don't know if your projects such as these, you recently signed an MOU in India to establish an India-Japan clean fund. Is
yes.
this a good example of the kind of new project that a new cluster or will support clusters that we're talking about here?
Well, thank you very much. But the India-Japan Fund is not exactly about the industrial clusters. We are an equity investor in NICDC, National Industrial Corridor of India, where we build industrial parks. And yes, and we have done it in Vietnam or Indonesia. We are JBIC, official financial agency that supports Japanese business abroad. And as we have supported Japanese company build and operate industrial parks in Vietnam, in countries like Vietnam or in Indonesia. And through our experiences in Asia or in other developing countries, what I would first say is that innovation comes from imitation, imitation and imitation. And imitation plus imitation or imitation multiplied with imitation leads you to innovation. So you shouldn't ask for some kind of state-of-the-art technology, but you could start from imitation. That's an important message when I talk to the emerging market ministers. And the other thing is that you could start from existing industries where, well, in low incomes in Africa too, there are already some industrial clusters in what sector or whatever. And although how small those companies are, how labor intensive those companies are, you should start from the existing industries because there's a reason that the industry is there and it is creating added value. So you should be investing in those industrial clusters and develop if you get it right. And if you get it right in imitation as well, you would be developing innovative industry, competitive or collaborative set of industry that will bear innovation in the future. But how do you get it right? There is a whole lot of things the government can do and the operator can do as well.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of that. And I really liked, Lei, your analogy to Manchester. That's very interesting. Existing industry, how do you transform what's already on the ground? And that may be the goal of thinking about frameworks and governance. What does it take for co-located companies, right, industries? This isn't just going to happen by itself. What does it take from all of the players? Even if you have the geographic advantage that you've talked about with the ports or the history that you have with BASF, what does it take to go from having a bunch of companies in the same place to having an industrial cluster that can aim toward common goals of economic growth and decarbonization? Who wants to jump in there?
I could start. I mean, the starting point, I think, for everything you do is competitiveness. And as I said earlier, I mean, there are some elements in there. There is the right location where you have logistical access, where you have opportunities for new green energy. You have also, in my eyes, to be close to the markets. But then it's about who is actually partnering up, and everything is about also of economies of scale. I mean, the bigger you can build, usually specifically, you have lower cost. That is also why it is attractive always to have partners. You share the risks on one hand, but you also can share infrastructure in building this together. You have actually a safe setup by having, for example, a customer or a supplier being with you. That doesn't mean that you have 100% of business with each other, but a base load. So this is the kind of considerations you have. And we made this experience. My company is 158 years old, and we did that more than 100 years old. We still do the same principles today because they actually worked. The setup is differently, but let me at that point also say the standardization is not really helping, because what you have is in every location you have a specific setup. So it does not work that you roll out something. We have 6 Verbund sites and everything looks different in terms of scope, in terms of size, in terms of what kind of products you have. And I think that is an illusion that you have a blueprint and then you chuck, put it everywhere in the world. I think you have always to consider the framework condition, and there's a reason why Lai goes to to Inner Mongolia, because there's the right setup, but you would not do the same at another location. So,
right. So probably I give kind of a little bit different opinion, because so we have the ambition to actually develop 100 net zero industrial park. So for the world, with our partner and ourselves. And we always think about the productization. How can we, is there something can be standardized? Because for 100 parks. So we end up with 3 common building block. First common building block is the renewable energy system. So basically it's off-grid with advanced control technology, with combination wind, solar, and storage. This is an innovative renewable energy system. So every net zero industrial park is going to have this common building block. The second one is digital carbon management system, which is really to verify it's emission-free. It's a green energy, it's a green product, it's going to be really away from the green tariffs. The third one is the upstream and downstream industrial cluster. So we are not developing some random things, and which is always for the value chain. So this 3 common building block is kind of a flavor of standardization, but it's the national industrial park eventually is going to be configured by the common building block. But the contents, the shape could be different, but some common building block to determine the contents, that could be useful.
I feel like you're itching to jump in there.
Well, one of the key reasons of success of an industrial cluster is the proximity of lots of companies. And that's the role, the main role of a port authority, in my opinion, is to create the context where all those companies can be successful, can develop their future, sustainable future. And it begins with investing in common infrastructure. And the advantage of industrial clusters is that the distance between all those players is relatively small. So the investment is always high, but compared to other places in the world where you can invest in industries, well, in ports it's limited. And we are, second advantage of ports, most of the time the owners are public authorities. So we are patient investors. So the returns are acceptable when they are not in double figures. And that's not the case on other places. So if on top of that you invest in state-of-the-art infrastructure, also in digital infrastructure, then you can offer a platform to the players, the ones who are already there, but you can attract the missing links in the cluster. So our role, and that's another important role of a port authority, is to find the missing link. What kind of industry will reinforce the whole cluster, will help the transition for the other ones? And that's a key role, and we do that, of course, by and that's another luxury and role of the Port Authority, that's a community building role. It's to have a permanent discussion with all your companies to have a better and a very good understanding of what are their requirements, what do they need to be successful in 10, 20, 30 years. And that is the guideline. That's what triggers our strategy. Because a successful port authority with all your clients that are not successful is, of course, not the aim of the game. So our success depends on the success of the others.
So I think you said this in your opening remarks, but as a port authority, you sort of have a natural hub, right? Not every cluster is going to have that. You can play that community building role, right? Is part of the question here that we want to try to tackle, when you have clusters, is it possible to have clusters that are a little bit less sort of naturally, they may be co-located companies, but they're not quite so, they're not governed by a port authority. What do you do in that instance? Is that where you want to be developing some building blocks or a standardized framework?
Well, I think in every industrial park or port or wherever, there is a synergy. There always some synergy among those companies, and they can help, or they can compete each other. And either way, that will increase the competitiveness of each company. That's what I believe. Yeah. And also, there was some question about standardization or whether we can standardize or we can't. But there are a set of standard things that the governments can do and the operators to help those companies in the region or in the park. And as was mentioned, energy is a very important part of it, an increasingly important part. Industrial park business is quite unlike the other real estate business. You gotta just lend or sell all those land. You have to be a continual servicer, providing renewable energy, providing energy storage, or providing better management system. You always continue to work as a framework. So that's how it works, I would like to stress. And listening to you about the port, I think there is an added angle where industrial clusters are getting more important. In this age of political rivalry and economic disruption, clusters are more and more needed. Well, in the past, we could trade anywhere. Efficiency is the best strategy. But now, we have a lot of disruption in the economy and trade and investment. So we need to have shorter supply chains or duplex supply chains. And industrial clusters can be quite helpful in that regard as well.
Please.
If I may chip in here, I mean, I think what is totally different, if I think about when we built such a Verbund site 30, 40 years ago, it was mainly a company decision. If we talk today, I think this is no longer possible for a company alone. We very much depend on public-private partnership. We need the policy frame, not to talk about what the societal demands are. I mean, if we want to build a new cracker in Europe, basically public is going against this and they rather build it somewhere else, but not in Europe anymore. I think it is almost impossible to build a new cluster in Europe. Where you want to go, where you get the acceptance from society, where do you get the space for doing it, where do you get the support for it. So it is much more a very good instrument and an efficient instrument, I think, for developing countries to bring them up to speed and to basically close the gap to the lifestyle we have. So I think it is simply a reality that you need much, much more cooperation today, not only between the partners, but also a clear understanding what the framework conditions are from a regulatory point of view. I mean, we deal in Europe with the Green Deal. My company has 15,000 pages already to handle from the Green Deal. It's a complexity cost which is huge. So you go also to locations where actually regulation framework is much more simple, where you have actually clear principles that you can be economic, that you can have a business case for transformation, because that is, I think, a big topic here in Davos, that we wake up a little bit with all our dreams and ambitions of decarbonization. It needs also a business case. And also new settlements of industry need a business case. So I really would like to urge that we don't get anything done anymore in that world if we then get closer to each other to really collaborate, and that includes politics.
I think this opens a very good vein of discussion here. What kinds of policy? You're talking about the need to reduce regulatory burdens and administrative burdens in Europe particularly. These are going to be different questions. It's probably difficult for us to just give a broad brush answer to sort of what policy steps are needed, but what kinds of measures, other measures in Europe, but also in developing countries, can be useful for lawmakers, for governments to undertake? What kinds of policies? And also, actually, when you mentioned the Green Deal, are policies and subsidy programs like the Green Deal and the IRA, are those helpful, or do they promote a kind of national competition that's less helpful?
Absolutely. I mean, if you compare the US conditions under the IRA and you consider the same principle in Europe, it's very clear where you have the business case. You have the business case in the US, but you don't have it in Europe. And that will shift investments. And this is, I think, the problem of Europe. You don't have a business case in Europe in the moment. So we have really to think about whether we regulate ourselves to death or we become a little bit more realistic to find framework conditions that are not punishing but more incentivizing. And I think more than ever before, we are in a global race for investments. So companies go where you get the better conditions.
All right. So, follow up this the regulation and policy kind of framework, so which actually, that's the reason we want to develop net zero industrial park, particularly in these developing countries. So especially greenfield. Mm-hmm. So think about these regions. Normally have abundant wind and solar. We particularly like the desert. There's no government there, probably, no regulation. So little regulation. But this place have a tremendous power. It's about you have created a machine to turn this tremendous power become the most cost competitive emission-free product. Mm-hmm. So that's why we invent the framework of net zero industrial park. And this is tremendous opportunity for developing country to have a second move advantage. Yeah. So not too much regulation, is future-proof, green-oriented, and with focus on the green industrial systems. And particularly nowadays with digital solution and AI improvement, lots of factory, you don't need too many people. Also can be remote controlled, or also by robot. Then to producing industrial goods in this remote area, in the Gobi or desert area, remote area, is not being challenged to find talent. So that's, I think, this net zero industrial park is really a good vehicle to help developing countries to actually capture the opportunity for this net zero transition.
In the global race for investment, Hayashi-san, how would you think about clusters? Does it make a difference? I mean, there are legislative frameworks. In Europe, it may be difficult to create new industrial clusters, but you have some that are already existing and quite strong. How do these clusters play into that global race for investment? Will money find them? Will they be magnets?
Well, regulations, as has been talked, is very important. And every country in Asia strives to making industrial parks, industrial clusters, and if they build it, people will come. That's their thinking. But it doesn't happen. The government has to change their very slow regulation, the very slow process of permits. It's always the problem for us and for the companies. And so we have to be, industrial cluster is a good thing because the companies get together and put a pressure on the government. Mm-hmm. And now, as we are doing more and more business in India, at least the Indian minister is very responsive. When I talk to him that in certain industrial park, the power outage is still there. And he calls his staff and tells directly that you have to do something about it. So these things are slowing to move, but if you go to state bureaucracy, it's always the same. These are things. But Indian government is trying to change. And well, I don't want to name it, but in Vietnam, everything is very slow. Unfortunately, it takes years, not months, to proceed the project. And unfortunately, or fortunately, there is so much investment going on to Vietnam now out of China or China plus one. So the government or state government doesn't feel too much pressure of that they have to change. So whenever we go, or some Japanese company who do a lot of good employment, even for them, in order to set up a new factory, and even though they know who to talk to, it takes quite a long time and quite a long cost. So by having industrial clusters, you could raise a voice and try to keep on pressuring the governments that they need to do something. They need to do their homework.
I want to ask the audience if you have questions, but just before we do that, do you have any examples where you have, as representatives of or participants in clusters, actually worked with other stakeholders in the ecosystem to try and deal with? I mean, we're really hearing here that a main theme is, regulatory burdens and permitting issues. Have you used your sort of collective clout in any particular cases you can share, either Jacques or Martin, maybe?
Well, as a port in Europe, and an important port in Europe, we develop much more our international footprint. So we are investing and co-investing in Brazil, for instance, in the port of Açu, but since more than 10 years in Oman, in the port of Duqm. And it's a greenfield port. And the idea of the Oman authorities was to, well, create a kind of Antwerp, an industrial cluster in their country, out of nothing. And then we see the difference in what is feasible, the timeline, the regulation, the role of authorities, the cooperation. And you see what we've done there in 10 years. It's really unthinkable looking at what is possible in Europe these days. So that's a good thing. So in green fields, if you have the right partners with the right mindset, looking more at incentives than in penalties, then you can do really, on a short term, important things. And I think Martin and others can confirm, because they are doing and developing business in other continents than Europe, that the principle of an industrial cluster really makes sense. And you can make a huge difference on the short term. But you have to put a few conditions. Otherwise, forget the acceleration. Penalties or uncertainty on regulation is killing. The capital hates this. Well, capital flows where the returns are, but capital hates uncertainty. And switch in regime and switch in approaches. So I think industrial clusters in the world, even in Europe, has a bright future. But we have to watch out, and especially in Europe, to over-regulate. It's becoming increasingly difficult to develop even a well-functioning and powerful industrial cluster as the Port of Antwerp. The permits, it's something that is really killing a business case. And getting these days a permit in Europe for anything is becoming very, very tough. And looking at the Green Deal, and the Green Deal is a good thing because it puts some targets on the long term, but then you have to leave it to the ones who will implement the target. So the hashtag, how do we do this, leave that to the doers. And the politicians, they can put some targets, but then you have to trust your companies. They are professionals. They know what they can do. And if you over-regulate, then you take, in part, the role of your industry, of your professionals. And The more I look at the regulation in Europe, the less I understand why they do this.
But let's be a little bit positive. I can confirm that. I think what you need today is a kind of give and take approach. When we came up with the 10 billion for Bunzai in China, I went to the authorities and said, I will build you the petrochemical cluster with the lowest carbon footprint. But I need from you 1, 2, 3, 4. I get everything in China to make this happen. And they want to have this site, which is the lighthouse project for the petrochemical industry in the world. They are certainly happy that it's not in Europe and not in the US, but in China. So I get the support for it. So there's a benefit for both sides. But normally I'm the negative person about Europe. So I have to bring in a little bit positive spirit about Europe here, there. In Jacques, when we think about our decarbonization project, which is subsidized also by funds from the European Commission, and also the Belgian authorities helped us. Yes, it's comparably slow with China, but also here, Antwerp wants to be the first one who has the CCS project in Europe. So we get also support over there. So I think it's always the carrot. And the carrot is interesting for a state leader. The carrot is also interesting for a certain region in order to mobilize and to get faster. It could be much faster and should be much faster. But I think the principle, if you do something innovative, if you commit to something, and then you have a demand on the other side to say, you have to do that to make that happen, it also to a certain extent works in Europe. Because there's also competition between
Quickly, and then let's ask if there.
Well, I'm not quite, I don't know if I'm positive or negative, but Europe is constantly regulating.
Yeah, it's true.
Constantly. So it's very transparent and predictable. But while that is not the case in US, you talked about IRA. It's a big magnet. Very many Japanese companies would like to invest in US. But what happens after Trump 2.0? There's so much uncertainty and so much unsustainability in the US policy.
Right.
On that note,
yeah, I also like to add on is seeing the limitation or challenge for Europe to develop the green industrials is about the limitation to the access of abundant renewable energy. So end of the day, so we have to rely on the green fuel to power the industrial system. Now Europe is something existing is for offshore wind, but still quite expensive, and also is not everywhere. But from another point, why the port is so important. Port could be a great terminal to receive the green molecules, green hydrogen, green ammonia, green methanol, back to Europe, maybe from Morocco, from Namibia, from Middle East, from Australia, through this vessel, and with little cost, Europe is going to get a very cost-competitive green fuel rather than natural gas. So that's, I would see the future industrial cluster is going to surrounding your port or all the major port. It's going to be my new findings.
Okay.
Could be.
This is a great moment to go to the audience and see whether you have any questions. Yes, in the front, please. Can you stand up for us?
Thank you, Saudi Arabia. Bandar Kharib, Minister of Industry and Mining, Saudi Arabia. Very nice discussion. What I just sensed is most of the clusters are being naturally evolving. So my question is the chicken or the egg. We have an ambition plan in Saudi to grow the sector. And we have a kind of experience in Jubail, Niamba, some of you know this. But my question is, how can we accelerate? How can we, as a government, create these clusters, push them forward, and not wait for them to evolve either through around a port or around a large investor? Thank you.
If I may ask, I mean, I would say it is that you have to prepare infrastructure. And I think from an investment point of view, infrastructure was always and is still over-crucial. And I have to say in Europe, we have an old-fashioned, no longer up-to-date infrastructure. If you take Germany after the war, one of the reasons why this economic miracle happened, it had one of the world best infrastructure. What did we do over the last 30 years? We've actually not reinvested in our infrastructure. It's a lousy, below-average infrastructure. And that is what you can do. I think you have to basically prepare and advertise with a world-class infrastructure. And I'm very sure you get companies who get on the hook on that because that is part of their success. And if you have basically prepared for that, and then you have relatively quick conditions, you can prepare conditions for permits where you just fill in the products, but the rest is already done, kind of blueprint contracts, and make this permitting process simple. That doesn't mean irresponsible, but simple. Then I think you prepare for the best you can as country to get investments.
Well, I agree very much that you should be investing. Well, I would, to any minister, say that infrastructure is the most important thing. But I wouldn't say it to you, because you are already investing so much, or maybe too much in infrastructure. But I would like to say that you should be investing in human beings. I said innovation is about imitation. But, well, you can imitate technology or business model, but you can't imitate people. You have to develop your own human resources. And, well, unfortunately, as we do some work in your country, there is still a very deficit of human resources, of your people. So please invest more.
That points to the need for different building blocks in different places. Let's have another question in the front, I think.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Anin Bakri from Indonesia. Lei mentioned about this net zero industrial park in Ordos, which is a place for coal. So we have this island called Sulawesi where you have all the copper and also nickel pretty much in Indonesia. And we certainly would like to develop an industrial park because not only you have the critical minerals, but of course you can also develop renewable energy, even combined with gas for the baseload, for example. So what are the things for the panelists, because you are players in your own respective industries, are important to evaluate what may happen in Sulawesi, for example?
Let's just be really quick, sort of like, because we're running out of time, but what can you all chip in a little bit? What are the elements?
Right. We have been working with Aning for oversee net zero industrial park in Sulawesi. I think is tremendous opportunities. This place have so much abundant minerals underground, but also abundant resources, energy above ground, wind and solar. But previously, this is not locally circulate. So some country people taking mineral to certain region and using that energy, fossil fuel energy to process and selling back. But actually, by building the net zero industrial park, you are able to create a circulation above ground with underground resources, which is really efficient. Then we see the tremendous opportunity to build this battery material cluster for nickel, for even cathode, for the battery, even for the EV in the future. So this is definitely is the great example for Sulawesi.
Does anyone else want to add anything about what's needed or what the elements would be that would?
Well, one component I would add over there is that you should also differentiate in terms of environmental topics. I mean, we have a project in your country where also NGOs step up and they claim about this and you cannot do this and this and this. So I think if you develop these new areas, I think you should have something which makes this location better in aspects of social integration, social justice, environmental issues, providing also renewable energy, supporting that, also connecting economies of scale. So I think that is, again, your differentiating part. Everyone wants to have nickel for the EVs, but there are not so many locations where you can go to. But that's an opportunity, a great opportunity for your country by simply making things better fitting to the societal needs of today.
Also bring Jack to help you build a world-class port, which is very important because at the end of the day, all products have to ship all over the world, a world-class port infrastructure.
But happy to do that.
Okay, we've got a new cluster coming together.
One of the key ingredients of success were already mentioned. So is the location the right location? And if, of course, you have natural resources, that's a key strength that you have. But of course, who are your stakeholders? What is the environmental, what are the people living around? And then, do you have human capital? Will you have capital? Do you have everything in place to become successful? Because what we see in the world, and we have a small affiliate, Port of Antwerp Bruges International, helping many ports and authorities in the world to think about industrial clusters and developing ports, greenfield ports, of enlarging existing ports. And we have experts in discussing this and developing a kind of roadmap. And where are the key ingredients? What are the key ingredients for being successful, not on the short term, but on the longer term? Because the infrastructure that you will require is something that will last hopefully for 50 or 60 years. So it's a very delicate exercise that you have to take into account. And we see that in many countries there are a willingness to be on a very short term successful because there is one ingredient in place, but you miss some others.
I think we're out of time. I want to thank you all for this really interesting conversation on how to build on natural strengths and create or develop clusters, and how to think about the challenges to standardized approaches of governance in general for clusters. And I think also something that I heard here is that these industrial clusters, both in terms of reaching goals such as decarbonization, but also at a time of, as you put it, Hayashi-san, a time of increased political disruption and fragmentation, these clusters have the potential to allow the private sector and the public sector to work together and to play a role in driving economic growth. So thank you very much for all of your comments. Thank you. And
well, thank you.